Hello, welcome to Cat 109, the history, politics, and ethics of cannabis. In today's lesson, we're going to be talking about why it's so difficult to legalize cannabis or marijuana in the USA. So, the first question we have to really address is how did we get here? Or why is cannabis legal on the state level but not the federal level? Well, blame your founding fathers who aimed to balance states' rights, and that was Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who, by the way, were neighbors in Virginia, versus federalism, and that was John Adams, our second president, in the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. The federal government and every state have the right to maintain its own laws as to which drugs are illegal and which are not. So you have all 50 states plus the federal government. States' rights advocates have used the 10th Amendment to press for movement on issues including removing Native Americans from their lands, not one of our greatest moments, but that happened back in the 1800s in Georgia, slavery, the civil rights movement, the death penalty, assisted suicide, same-sex marriage, and gun control. So clearly anything that's even slightly controversial ends up becoming a states' rights versus federal government. Individual states are much better at moving with the times than the federal government is. So, in addition, we have something called the supremacy clause. This means that courts have decided that under the supremacy clause of the Constitution, federal law is superior to state law, and that under Article 3 of the Constitution, the federal judiciary has the final power to interpret the Constitution. Therefore, the power to make final decisions about the constitutionality of federal laws lies with the federal courts, not the state courts. And therein lies the rub. And the states do not have the power to nullify federal laws. So essentially, when there is a conflict between federal and state laws, the federal law is considered the supreme law. And here's an example of the supremacy clause that has nothing to do with modern day topics that we're talking about, but was actually pretty, and it still is pretty significant to trade and commerce. So the ship on the left is Get Out. New York gave me the exclusive right to operate steamships in New York waters. On the right, the steamship says wrong. New York gave the United States the exclusive rights to regulate interstate commerce. So again, a lot of these issues come down to going back to a document that was written, 250 years ago that we have to figure out how to interpret. So let's talk about state legalization. While individual states have legalized medical and/or recreational cannabis, a law's legitimacy under state law does not affect its legality under federal law. So in other words, it can be legal under state law and illegal under federal law, exactly where we are with marijuana right now. So an act may be legal at the same time that it's illegal. The states that have legalized marijuana use have not attempted to declare that the federal marijuana laws are invalid or unenforceable. Federal marijuana laws still are valid and enforceable even in states that have made marijuana legal under state law. These states have not attempted to nullify federal law. So they're just saying, okay, that's the federal law, state law, but we're not trying to say the federal law is wrong. We're just saying that the state law is how we're using our legality issues. So, in a nutshell, states can have whatever laws they want with regard to marijuana or any other drug. So, under Barack Obama, he had sent out to the Federal Drug Administration and the DEA that he was not concerned too much about marijuana laws being violated. He wanted to focus more on the harder drugs. Under Donald Trump, and specifically Jeff Sessions, there was an increased attention paid to marijuana laws because Jeff Sessions is particularly anti-cannabis. Since he was removed from office, meaning Jeff Sessions, the current Attorney General, Bill Barr, he has bigger issues to worry about, so there has not been significant push to force states into declaring marijuana to be illegal in all cases. So, no state is required to have a law prohibiting or regulating marijuana. So, if you don't have any law, that's fine. Of course, then you look at the federal law. The Supreme Court has repeatedly held that Congress cannot force states to enact laws. Such coercion violates the 10th Amendment. So back in 8th grade, when you were going through those amendments, if they still do that, and you wondered why you would ever need to know this kind of stuff, now you know. So a state could choose to have no law prohibiting marijuana, or a law prohibiting marijuana with an exception for medical use, or a law allowing possession of small amounts of marijuana, or anything else. So one of the things that states have done is decriminalize cannabis use. So what that means is they have relaxed enforcement of their possession laws. This doesn't mean that it's legal. It just means that it's decriminalized. And that means that some states and municipalities have relaxed criminal enforcement of laws prohibiting possession or use of the marijuana. Decriminalization should not be confused with legalization. However, instead of facing a criminal penalty, the individual is charged with non-criminal violation, which results in a fine and no criminal record. That's important. That is incredibly important. Think of how many jobs are in the healthcare field, for example, that require you to have a background check. So, for example, under New York Penal Code, marijuana possession is treated as a non-criminal violation if the person possesses 25 grams or less, or approximately 2 ounces, and the person was in a non-public space. So we don't want you sitting in the middle of Times Square smoking a big doobie, because you are going to be violating the non-public place aspect to the law. So instead of being arrested, the person would be given a summons, which is a notice to appear in front of a hearing officer. Under New York Penal Code Section 22105, the person can be fined up to $100 for a first violation, $200 for a second violation within 3 years, and $250 with the possibility of up to 15 days in jail for a third violation within 3 years. So essentially the same as parking meter violations in a sense. So the next question is, why is the federal government dragging their feet with legalization? It seems to make a lot of sense. We've been talking all term about how many states have legalized medical cannabis or recreational cannabis. Well, there are a multitude of issues that have emerged that make the federal government unwilling to actively work towards legalizing cannabis. And guess what? We're going to talk about all of them. So, first problem, what schedule would cannabis be assigned? Currently, cannabis is a Schedule 1 drug, giving it the equivalent status of heroin, because that's a very similar drug. Some have suggested that cannabis be removed from the DEA schedule entirely, but that appears unlikely because there's a lot of people who are still prejudiced against cannabis use. And when you look at the politics, especially in the United States, the vast majority of Democrats are in favor of legalization, while a fairly slim majority of Republicans are against legalization. Some of your big Republican people are coming out and saying, we have to address this because it is literally a giant green elephant in the room. Others have suggested that cannabis be moved to Schedule 2, where OxyContin is listed. Schedule 2 drugs have medical value, but also have a high likelihood for abuse. because you have so many people dying of cannabis overdoses, just like OxyContin. No? Oh, wait, I forgot. The other issue with it being classified as a Schedule II drug would mean that the FDA would enforce strict oversight, which could delay cannabis treatments while approved clinical studies validate its effectiveness. So that's one of the big issues. And again, it's if people put their mind to it, they could figure it out. But you have a lot of different opinions right now that people are much more likely to just walk away from the bargaining table. Then we have an issue with corporate tax rates. Now, before you all go to sleep on me, just remember tax is something we all pay, but some pay more than others. And in this case, the U.S. Tax Code 280E is a tax rule that does not allow businesses that sell federally illegal substances, as defined by the Controlled Substances Act, from taking normal corporate income tax deductions. Instead, assuming cannabis-based businesses are making profits, it means that these companies still have to pay federal income tax, and without corporate tax deductions, they could be on the line for an effective tax rate of 70 to 90%. So what that basically means is a state-run dispensary could literally be on the line. If they made $1 million, they could either have to pay somewhere between $700,000 to $900,000 in tax. That's a lot of money. So the average person pays about 25% in tax. So these corporate rates for illegal products that are illegal federally but not state are pretty significant, which is why, if you're wondering why legal cannabis is so expensive, that's a big portion of it. Such a huge effective tax rate is a benefit to the federal government, and they may not want to give that up. So again, what we're looking at here is a system that is admittedly broken, but the federal government is still benefiting in a lot of ways. So another major problem is, what is driving under the influence for somebody who uses cannabis? With marijuana, there are no guidelines that define impairment behind the wheel. Cannabis breathalyzers are currently in development by a number of companies, but they're not ready for a real-world rollout. They're not reliable yet. And the bigger issue is that, THC, as we all know, is the psychoactive component of cannabis, the piece that gets you high, stays in your body for weeks and potentially a month. So it makes it very difficult for a police officer to identify when you might have ingested THC. So for example, let's say the night before you took a gummy, you went to sleep, you had a wonderful night's sleep, you woke up early, you took a shower, you got dressed, you're going to work, and you get pulled over. Is the THC still in your body? Yeah. Is it still affecting your brain? No. But again, therein lies the problem. It's very difficult to identify people who have, in fact, ingested and determining their impairment levels. So another big issue is the lack of scientific studies. But again, the federal government made it virtually impossible to get these kinds of scientific studies completed. So in an evaluation by the Health and Human Services Department, they declared that cannabis should not be legalized because its chemistry is unknown and non-reproducible. It doesn't have enough safety and efficacy studies, and it is currently not accepted by the experts. Ironically, academic and scientific studies have been stymied because of the lack of legal cannabis available to conduct these studies on. And that's important because the federal government only wants you to use a very, very particular brand or strain of marijuana to use the testing on. And it all had to be grown at one place. So under the 1961 International Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs and the 1970 Controlled Substances Act, the federal government is the single agent allowed to provide marijuana for research. Until 2016, the DEA has only authorized one grower, the University of Mississippi, which grows marijuana under contract with the National Institute on Drug Abuse. Researchers had to go through the DEA in order to request the cannabis supplies from the University of Mississippi. I know you're going to be shocked, but researchers at other universities found the process overly complicated and arduous to manage. Now, in the last couple of years, more universities have been identified as centers where they can grow and use the product for scientific studies. But for the longest time, this did not exist. There was one place and one place only. Another argument is, what about the children? A significant concern is that legal access to cannabis will make it more appealing to teenagers. However, a recent national survey on drug use and health by the U.S. government published some surprising results. In Colorado, one of the first states to have legalized recreational cannabis, a little more than 9% of teens aged 12 to 17 admitting to using marijuana between 2015 and 2016. Comparably, between 2013 and 2014, just before and during the initial launch of adult use cannabis in the state, use rates for teens aged 12 to 17 was a considerably higher 12%. So I know 9% and 12% don't seem to be huge numbers, but when you're talking about hundreds of thousands of young people, that is a pretty large number. And what they found was legalizing adult recreational cannabis actually led to a drop in use by teenagers because it's not as cool if it's legal. That's how teenagers see things. Another issue is the underground marketplace. Legal cannabis is taxed and subject to the state regulations where it's sold, which makes it more expensive than the black market stuff. The illegal marketplace is still drawing customers because they are slashing the prices so that illegal cannabis can be cheaper than the legal product. And this was highlighted in 2019 with identification of counterfeit vape cartridges that made many people severely ill and even killed some. And there's some interesting comparison between a real cartridge and a fake cartridge over there on the left. Law enforcement agencies all across the country have also been complaining that people trafficking cannabis in from legal states is making their jobs more difficult. So you have the black market or the underground marketplace that was supposed to be reduced because people could get it legally. Well, if it's expensive and legal, they'll still go with the inexpensive and illegal version. A lot of people just don't have a ton of money to spend $200 or $300 a month on their medical cannabis that they may need. Finally, of course, we have the wonderful world of racism. I know we've talked about this throughout the class, but according to a 2013 study, Caucasians and African Americans use marijuana at roughly the same rate. But African Americans are over 3.5 times more likely than whites to be arrested for possession of marijuana. Like all drug laws, the prohibition against marijuana is much more likely to be enforced against African Americans and Latinos than against Caucasians. The Commonwealth Attorney for the City of Norfolk in Virginia found that 80% of first offense marijuana possession arrests in Norfolk were African Americans in 2016 and 2017, despite the city's population being 43% African American. The numbers are there. You can see that racism, even people who don't think of themselves as racist, have those hidden microaggressions that have been given to them through their entire childhoods, and they may end up believing something that's not correct at all. The point being is that while African Americans constitute a majority of small possession cases, they are only 20% of the population in Virginia. So, when we see this disparity in numbers, that's how we can tell subtle racism is at work because the numbers don't add up. All right, so here we have some works cited. Always look for your works cited. Let me remind you of that. If you have any questions, please feel free to text or email me. If you're not in my class but you have a question or a comment, please feel free to leave me a comment. Otherwise, have a fantastic day.